Good morning. All right, so let's pull out our short sheet, and while we're in Latin mode, I don't have one. Thank you. And while we're in Latin mode, having been listening to the chants, let's do the Latin version. This is our last time together. So, Ave Regina Caelorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve Radix, Salve Porta, ex quo mundo lux es orta, Gaude Virgo gloriosa, super omnis speciosa, vale o valde decora, et pro nobis Christum exora. Amen. So this will be your Latin primer. So as we finished today, and we talked about so it is, as it is above, so it is below, is this ordering of thought, this idea that, and this understanding that we begin to order our thoughts first thing in the morning. We begin to order our thoughts as soon as we have consciousness. This is why it's so important to do the morning offering. Now I want to go back and clarify or reiterate a couple of principles with regard to this mission. How many of you, well, I shouldn't say it that way. Many of you may think that what I'm suggesting and what I'm saying is unattainable. What I'm laying out for you is plan A. And so plan A is plan A. It is the ideal. It is that for which we should strive. But it should be viewed one of two ways, is not that it's unattainable or unachievable, but to always be as the ideal to achieve. And if we don't achieve it, we're not to be despairing or feel the feeling of futility, any of those things which would be sins against the second person of the Trinity, which is Christ, which is hope. And so you have to remember that as we go through this human experience, we're not going to have the ideal life. But we must also realize that no one has. The Blessed Mother didn't have the ideal life. You stop and think about it. Her life is a life of tumult. Everyone wants to emulate the Blessed Mother, the peace that she had, right? Her life is anything but tumultuous. I mean, she has to go from here to there. She gives birth in a stable. Then they're spirited away to quickly flee away to Egypt. Then they come back. They live in relative isolation from her family or the remnants of her family and his family, which are the country, the society is grossly divided. The hierarchy is corrupt. There's not valid sacrifice in the temple. Does this sound familiar to anyone? And so her life is not a life of peace. And then to watch her son horribly murdered, horribly killed by the very people that he came to save, and her very people. Yet she has perfect peace. Her will is in perfect conformity to God's holy will, which is salvation. Right? So her life was not plan A, but her response was plan A. Do you see? So many times we have little to no effect or little to no control of the cause. We have 100% control of our response. So we got little control with regard to cause. We've got some control with regard to effect. We've got 100% control with regard to our response. And so if we're going to live plan A, if we're going to try to achieve an ideal, then we have to look at it that way, is that providence dictates what happens, the cause. Many times. Now, there's no merit in self-inflicted suffering. And a big percentage of our suffering or our angst is self-inflicted. And there's no merit in that. It's not God's will that we do stupid stuff. It's not God's will that we sin. It's not God's will that we do things that are against the unity of the relationship. God's will is union, so anything that we do that is against that, that's on us. That's on us, and that's why there's a need for the reparation of sin. For sin, need for reparation. So again, what I'm describing to you is plan A. What I'm describing to you is in light of spiritual warfare. What I'm describing to you is what the saints said: if you do these things, or if you refrain from doing these things, then that's the path to sainthood. So I should have asked at the beginning, how many of you want to be saints? Then this is a very arduous path. You better be intimately familiar with plan A. And it's not that you have to live plan A, it's that you have to aspire to live plan A. Yes? That's the battle. That's the battle. And all of us are fighting that battle to various degrees because of our fallen nature. And so that is the battle. That's the path to sanctity. And if it was easy, anyone could do it. Pretty simple. So I want to, I skipped over. I jumped in there and we just took off at a high trot. I want to go back and illustrate as it was above, so it is below, and a morning offering and how you set your mood for the day. It's always good to remember where we are in the liturgical season. So in this liturgical season, we're nearing Lent. And so this is a time for the examination of conscience. What is it that makes me weak? What is it that I'm attached to? What can I address as a form of attachment over these 40 days in the desert? And so that's a good overall thought to have right now. We're in a period of examination of conscience. The modern calendar ambushes us with Lent. It just comes up and just bang, there it is, Ash Wednesday. But in the traditional calendar, we have 3 Sundays, the Gisima Sundays, and then the weeks of liturgy in between to prepare for this. So it's as if, have you ever just walked into confession cold? You look up, oh, they're having confessions. You walk in and there's not been an adequate time to examine your conscience. And so you're still examining your conscience when you leave the confessional. And so the point is to fully imbibe in the beauty and the spiritual value of the season. Begin right now. Start preparing for Lent. Start preparing physically for Lent. You don't have to start fasting, but you have to start saying, why don't I just open up the pantry and look? I'll tell you one of the things that we do for Lent, and a lot of people do, and anciently it was a very common practice, is get rid of your perishables between now and Ash Wednesday. This is Fat Thursday, which was yesterday. This is Mardi Gras, which is coming up on Tuesday. But get rid of your perishables and then live out of your pantry and your freezer for Lent. Don't buy groceries. What you would have spent on groceries, give to the poor. That's the giving of alms. But all of us, most all of us, have 40 days worth of stuff in our pantry. Now, it may not be your first choice, but at one point you bought it and you put it in the pantry. Now's the time to do that. And so to empty, to live off of that which we have stored up, both literally and figuratively, is a good practice for Lent. And to say, at one point, 3 pounds of grated coconut was so vital that I bought 3 pounds of grated coconut. What was I going to do with that? You see what I mean? And so it's a good way to get us spiritually to look at the things that we've accumulated in our life. Also, it's a very good thing. It's a good time to go through your library. You got books you're not going to read. Come on, you know it and I know it. You've got books that you've read that you're not going to read again. You know it and I know it. Get rid of them. Pare down. Out of consideration for those who are going to inherit your junk precious treasures, lean down. Lean down. If you've ever, lean as in reduce down. We don't need all the stuff. And Lent is a perfect time to give to libraries, to give to parish libraries, to give to people, RCIA programs, to give those things away that we're not using and that we're not going to use. So you have to be realistic with yourself. Yes? Yep. Yep. Yeah, it's great. I mean, this is really and truly, Lent is the time to be doing this, and whatever you're doing above, what you're doing spiritually, what you're doing in your head, now has a physical, a tangible activity that you tie it to. So again, grace flows vertically before it's spread horizontally. And so you start to encourage this disposition in your heart to dispose, to lean down, to get rid of those things that we're attached to. And it's amazing how effective this is in your household. Just you're taking inventory of everything.
I heard of a program, I don't know what I think every day of Lent would take in your house and get one article, do it out and put it aside, sort of like what you're talking about. Okay, I don't.
So this is that period of time when we're going through that examination of conscience, that taking inventory. What are these things that I have accumulated that have no real eternal consequence? So to give you an overlay also, a lot of things have symbolism that we lose. How many of you are familiar with the symbolism, or how many of you are familiar with Mardi Gras tradition of tossing coins and beads? You know where that comes from? So Reclamation Theology, sign up for those reflections, especially during Lent. Sign up for that Holy Week retreat. I'm urging you, this will really deepen your Lenten experience. You can find them at www.montecristo.net. The tradition is that affluent people, especially in France and Spain, affluent people would make pilgrimages, they would have religious experiences during the year, and they would accumulate rosaries, chaplets, saint medals. That's what they would accumulate in all of their pilgrimages. And then in Lent, right before Lent, they would give all these things away to the poor, because the poor could not afford the rosaries, the chaplets, the blessed medals, and so often the landowners would give these to all the people, the sharecroppers and the people who were working their land. And so this is where we get the beads and the coins from Mardi Gras. It's a mockery. Do you see it? Pretty amazing. The other thing, and has its root, is that it was customary for the nobility, for the affluent, to give clothing, to give other household items to the poor. There wasn't Walmart. There weren't these stores. There wasn't Dollar General. So the poor were largely dependent for cooking utensils, things they couldn't make, various household items. They were dependent upon the manor house to give them these things, and that was usually done during Lent. Coincide with spring cleaning, essentially, is go through everything and say, these are the things that we no longer are dependent upon and somebody else could be. Does that make sense? All right. So another issue, and the thought occurred to me on the way over here, and so I wanted to tell the story, and I wanted to tell it first, but I'll go back and pick it up. So when you make that morning offering, you get up in the morning, you can listen to the Reclamation Theology reflection, but whether you do or you don't, get a focal point early in the morning, a spiritual focal point. Where am I in the liturgy? Today is Friday, so every Friday is Good Friday for the Catholic. So this talk started at 10 o'clock. So the trial, he's on trial in front of Pilate. The crowd is shouting right now, and he's about to be condemned. That's what's happening. And so it's good to go through Friday, as every Friday is Good Friday. Every Thursday is Holy Thursday. Every Saturday is Holy Saturday. It's why it's Marian devotion on Saturdays. She held the faith for us all while he's in the tomb. And so these are the kind of things that if you get that thought fixed early in the morning in your head, then it can come back. And then there's other things is to look at the weather. So this morning it was raining, and it was raining pretty hard. And so there's a story, when the rain's hard, I have a particular association, and I'll share it with you, because all of us have memories. Remember we talked about in the emotion memory interface, you have sensory reaction to things. How many of you have a favorite memory that's associated with rain? So growing up, I can remember one of the very few times that I saw my grandfather break a Stoic model and actually enter a Dance of David jubilation kind of thing. Was it rained, I was about 6 or 7, and it rained very, very hard and long in southwest Texas, having been dry for almost 5 years. The joke was there were kids who had never seen it rain. And I was one of those kids that I didn't have a vivid memory until this one of a hard, steady, sustained rain. And my grandfather, the ground smells different. The parched ground, when it's been dry for that long and those first drops of rain hit it, it is a very unique smell. And so I associate that smell with this rain. And the drops were huge. They were like silver dollar size, and they hit. And I can still remember the pickup was a 1952 Chevrolet 1-ton pickup. And it was a faded blue, oxidized blue. And I can remember the drops hitting it, and they were a vivid blue under that drop. And then soon it was covered, and then the drops kept coming. And they would hit, and there would be a crown of mud come up And so I can remember that so very vividly, and him dancing in joy for the rain. And so that's one rain memory. The other rain memory is a story that is told. I was not there, but the story was told by a fellow that was. And so I'll share it with you. So the scene, I had a very, very good friend, God rest his soul, wonderful priest. We worked together quite a bit, and he died young. Incidentally, he died of a brain tumor when he was 41 years old. And so we were like brothers. And his death day is coming up. It is St. Cyril of Alexandria, which is the 18th of March. And if you remember, the 18th of March falls right between St. Patrick's on the 17th and St. Giuseppe, St. Joseph on the 19th. And so he had a great devotion to St. Joseph. His father's name was Joe, and he was Irish by heritage. He was straight Irish. And so he dies right between these two. Wonderful, like a brother. And so the story is right after, he's an order priest. He's an oblate of Mary Immaculate. He was ordained by Cardinal George. He was just an amazing priest. Anyway, for his ordination gift, his parents asked him, what would you like? Of course, he's got a vow of poverty. And so they said, what would you like? And he said, I would really like to go to Medjugorje. And so they said, okay. Said, we'll send you and one of your confreres, one of your classmates. And so this story comes from the classmate. So these two freshly ordained priests, oblates of Mary Immaculate, who they have a very distinctive habit. It's a black cassock, but it has some other accoutrement to it, and a very, very large pectoral cross. So one of the things about the Oblates of Mary Immaculate is they date way back. Their founder was Eugene de Mazenod, and he sent many young men to the Texas frontier, and they missionized South Texas and New Mexico horseback. They were called Christ Calvary, a wonderful, wonderful heritage. But they have a very large, a 9-inch pectoral cross that is part of their garb. And it's not on a rosary, it's on a very large cord, and then they also have a rosary. So these guys look like the old Pancho Villa bandits with two bandoliers. They cross. So they've got this pectoral cross, and then they've got this rosary. And both of them were weapons, because exorcism was very much a part of what they did. The other thing about that cross is every priest that had it, so his cross dated back to 1730, and the names of the priests were engraved. And so the priest, and they're all buried, those ones that came to Texas, they're buried in a cemetery in San Antonio. So on March 18th, I will be at that cemetery in San Antonio praying the Divine Mercy for Father Irving. So that's we made an agreement that whoever went first, the other one would do that. And I think he had a pretty good idea he was going to go first. So anyway, the story is these two freshly ordained oblate priest go to Medjugorje. And so his parents gave him a brand new pair of hiking boots, very expensive pair of hiking boots. And they told him, look, you're going to need these. The sandals simply are not going to work. So at our request, please wear these things, because we don't want to be responsible for crippling a priest. And so he takes these boots, but he was, as they say in Spanish, cabeza duro. He was hard-headed. And so these are very expensive boots. And so he goes, and it's been raining torrentially. This story comes from the other young priest. It's been raining torrentially. And so our guy is extremely tight. He's always been frugal. And so, in fact, when he went into the oblates, he brought with him his dowry, his inheritance from his grandmother, and gave it to the order as a dowry, because he was coming into the order. So he's at the base of the hill. Have any of you been to Medjugorje? I have not, but they tell me there's a very large hill that you have to climb up. And it's muddy, it's muddy, slick, nasty, all of these things. And so Father Jim doesn't want to ruin his boots, so he sits down, he takes off his boots, takes off his socks, pokes his socks in his boots, hides them under a bench. He's good to go, and he starts up. He gets about halfway up. Now this guy, he's the kind of guy that never wanted any attention. Very, very humble. He gets about halfway up, he stops to rest, and he looks down, and there's 400 barefoot pilgrims following him. What do you do? So anytime it rains, I have this bittersweet memory of Father Jim Irving. And I have this bittersweet memory of he at Medjugorje and listening to, and I've heard that story when the other priest and I get together, and he'll be there at that graveside on that day. Whenever we get together, he always tells that story. And so that's what I mean. So that's always locked in my mind, that bittersweet memory, and it falls on a Friday. Here's a priest who gave his life for God. Here's Jesus who gives his life for us. That kind of overlay sets your disposition for grace for the day. That keeps you open. And so if your mind returns to those type of things, then that disposition to grace remains open, and you see things differently, you see people differently. Does that make sense? So if we wanted to sum up, as it is above, so it is below, when we walk out of the house, we have a psychological disposition, we have a physical disposition. What are we leaving the house with? Are we a conduit of grace? Are we living in the world? Are we affecting a change? Are we living plan A? Are we just trying to get through the day? And so that's at the heart of what we're talking about. Now, I've laid out through the week, again, we talked about plan A. I wanted to be clear that we've done it from a standpoint of when you depart plan A, to the extent you depart it, is the extent you're vulnerable to the demon. If you depart it intentionally, if you make the choices that I'm not going to do this that I know is good for me, I'm going to do this, to the extent you depart the righteous, that's the extent to which you're vulnerable to the adversary. Why? Because there is psychological compatibility with the demon. If you are willing to shirk your responsibility under vocation, if you're willing to say, I believe in this part of the church, but not this part of the church, if you're willing to say things that pull you out of the flow of grace, if you're willing to say things, excuse me, that militate against the integrity of the economy of salvation, then the demon's going to be present. To the extent that you resist leadership, to the extent that you criticize leadership, to the extent that you buck up against authority, all of these are areas where the demon is present. Do they have to rise to the level of sin, mortal sin? No. He's there in the venial sin as well. He's there to encourage you in that venial sin. Most of the time, what happens is there's this slow darkening to where we don't see the implication of our thoughts, words, and deeds. So if we can grab our thoughts, if we can seize our thoughts and say, does this thought conform to Christ? This is St. Paul. Capture every thought, make it obey Christ. Every single thought. I don't want to do this. Does that conform to Christ? I don't agree with this particular thing. Does it conform to Christ? Now, there may be things that Christ didn't agree with, but that's the question, that's the criteria. I'm not saying you shouldn't criticize, you shouldn't disagree. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is whatever you do, it needs to have conformity to what our Lord did, what our Lord said, and the economy of salvation. Does that make sense? You also have to be sure you're in the right relationship with authority. And here's something that we don't do. These are some universal problems. Number one, is St. Paul is very, very clear that if you have a problem with your brother, go first to your brother. This is still the right procedure for conflict resolution among Christians and in Christian community. If you've got a problem with something, go first to your brother and go in private. Give him the opportunity to clarify or to reiterate his position, and give you the opportunity to say, Father, I heard you say this. Here's what I understood. Am I understanding? Am I hearing you correctly? Because the demon wants to interfere with communication. We want to interfere with communication. We want to hear what we want to hear. And so again, back to that disposition you leave with in the morning. If I'm already angry at somebody or I'm already having a problem with them, it's going to be very difficult for me to listen to them objectively. Have you found that out? It doesn't matter what they say, it just makes you more obstinate and more adverse. If that person's in a position of authority, especially spiritual authority, we've got to listen to them, because it doesn't mean we have to do what they say. We got to listen to them, because providentially, God has determined providentially that that voice, what they say, we need to hear. Hearing it and doing what they say are two different things, and I'll go into that. Okay, so it's a good question, because it's part of where we are in this discussion. So to admonish the sinner, first of all, to rebuke the sinner is further down the line. You're going to have some authority to do that. But to admonish the sinner, so here's a good way to say it. To rebuke the sinner is a vertical relationship with the sinner. You better have a vertical relationship. To admonish the sinner, you can do that on a peer relationship, on a filial relationship, on a horizontal relationship. So there's a difference between vertical authority and horizontal authority. So let's talk about that for a moment. In vertical authority, it's providential authority. This soul is in your care. That would be your children. That would be your students in a CCD class. That would be us or you as parishioners under Father. That's a vertical. That's not a horizontal. You're not on a horizontal plane with Father. You're on a vertical plane with Father. And so to understand that our reaction to that and discharge of authority is different in those two configurations. So let's talk through it. Only in a vertical relationship can you rebuke. That's stronger language. You can admonish in a horizontal. That's the third spiritual work of mercy. And they're in an order. They're in a sequential order. So we always want to start with admonishing the sinner. But there are two steps that precede it that have to be satisfied first before you get to the admonishment. The first one, now these are interchangeable depending upon which translation and which version of admonish the sinner. The first two, I'm telling you that they don't really matter which way you do it. It's kind of like confirmation and First Communion. In many dioceses, confirmation precedes First Communion. The point is baptism precedes both of those. Then we've got these two sacraments of initiation. So the first two spiritual works of mercy are counsel the doubtful and instruct the ignorant. And so these can come in either order, but they have to be done sequentially. And they have to be done one and then give it some time, and then two and then give it some time. So in the normal order of things, it is first of all to instruct the ignorant, which is, are you aware that the church has a teaching on this? And to violate that teaching, and here's the key language, binds under penalty of sin. Because if you're going to admonish the sinner, he has to know that what he's doing, and the language is binds under penalty of sin. Make sense? And so once you inform him, now you've given him an opportunity to do the right thing. All the spiritual works of mercy, all of these interactions with authority are predicated upon availing the other soul of the opportunity to do the right thing. Well, listen carefully to the order. First of all is the understanding that, a traffic stop. Do you know you were speeding? It kind of follows the same formula. But before you get to an admonishment, you have to make sure that the person knows two things. One, that the church teaches something, and two, that to not do this thing or to violate and do this thing binds under penalty of sin. And so that language is extremely important because, again, what is necessary for mortal sin? Grave matter and knowledge thereof. And so, do you know that's grave matter? Do you know that the church teaches? Or even if it's not grave matter, do you know this is a venial sin if you continue to do this? If you continue to tell white lies, if you continue to have deception, if you continue to tell people what they want to hear with no intention or ability to follow through, are you aware that that's a violation or that's a transgression of the eighth commandment? And so to speak precise language and draw it back to a Decalogue translation, that's part of instructing the ignorant. Instructing the ignorant is not, look, I don't like what you're doing. That doesn't rise to our level of obligation. So again, number one, do we have the obligation? Number two, instruct the ignorant. And then you go back, if they continue the behavior, you go back to counsel the doubtful and say, there's help for for this. Don't be despairing. You can change this behavior. And so this gives them, with prayer, with asking God, with applying for the annulment, with submitting yourself to authority, with whatever it may be, counseling the doubtful involves giving them a methodology to address what's the defect. Does that make sense? Then if they continue, now you admonish them. And you say, look, you know better. And you know there are consequences. So that's admonishing the sinner. And then if they don't respond, St. Paul says, you dismiss them. So you give them the opportunity, you give them a threefold opportunity to respond. And I think that's one of the keys is if we're in a position of authority, then we have an obligation to counsel these, to command. You have an obligation. Now in this horizontal structure, there's a lot that goes on right around here. And so you got to figure out, am I in a horizontal structure with these people or am I in a vertical structure? And what you're going to find is that with a lot of your parishioners and a lot of people, we're in a quasi-vertical structure because we are teachers, we are catechists, it doesn't mean that your soul has more merit. It means that providentially, by somebody superior to you, it has been decided that these souls are in your care. Yes, correct. Your obligation extends, it's only as big as the class. And so to know where our boundaries are, to know where... So it's authorization, it's commission, it's not license. Because license is specific to us. Commission is specific to the people we serve. Do you see the difference? And so to see authority in that light. Now, if you are an appointed counselor, if you're an appointed consultant, if you're an appointed advisory, now you have the obligation to counsel. But you've got to make sure that whoever set you in that position also told the person taking counsel that theirs is a subordinate position to yours. And that's where authority breaks down a lot of times. Is we commission the person in authority, but we don't tell the subject that they are subject to the authority of this person. Yes. Okay, so if you look at what is your disposition to these souls, siblings, you're on that's obviously a horizontal. It's on a horizontal plane. And so you have you have an obligation to counsel within the family, but by the same token, you have to instruct them. So you might just ask them, what do you understand the precepts of the church to be with regard to communion? And so it's not your opinion that they should go more often. It is a precept of the church that they should receive communion at least once a year, preferably in the Eastertide. Are we familiar with this? This is a precept of the church. It's also a first precept of the church is to discharge your obligation to attend the Holy Mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation. And so you simply ask them, are you aware that the church has guidelines, that the church has precepts with regard to the attendance of Mass on holy days of obligation, Sundays, and a precept with regard to the reception of communion. So that's step number one, and then allow them to respond. Okay, stop with the first statement. We have a tendency to nag. The second and third statement are nagging. First statement, instruct the ignorant. Just very simply, do you know the church has those precepts? Absolutely, it's hands off. Correct. You're done. You've discharged your obligation. Okay, so there's a difference between duty and obligation. And so obligation is those things that are formal to us in station in life, such as mother, such as wife. So we have obligations to our vocation. We have obligations. And so that's why it talks in the precepts of the church. We have a Sunday obligation. So an obligation is a higher level of association than duty. Does that make sense? Okay. So first of all, let's go back, and discourse is always a good opportunity. I would ask you and suggest you do not use the word married in reference to these type unions. So when you start and you say, I went over and these two women were married. No, they're not. And because married has a faith connotation, and so we got to understand that if any word has a distinct meaning in our faith, we're relegated to use that word in that context. Do you see what I mean? And so, because as Catholics, as faithful Catholics, our lexicon must first conform to our faith. Society is second. When we start doing that, we start getting distance, and you start realizing it's harder and harder for me to navigate this society because we're not even speaking the same language. And so that's the first thing, is get in our head that, and the same with regard to the relationships. We use the term irregular marriage. We use it a lot. That's not an acceptable term. It's simply not an acceptable term. A marriage is a marriage. When people are living together, that's an adulterous relationship. That's living together. That's not marriage. It doesn't matter how the state defines marriage. Anytime there's a disparity between a word, how it's used secularly and how it's used in faith, we as faithful Catholics have to give primacy to the Catholic or the faith definition of that word. Does that make sense? And so typically when she says, I was raised Catholic, then very simply you say, do you know where the nearest Mass is? Do you know what parish you're living in? Well, it's Father so-and-so, and the church is here. And so you always bring the conversation back. And if they say, well, I no longer go to church, no worries. Confessions are Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock. But it keeps you on the high ground and you have no angst. You don't have a right, because a right is a different thing. You may have a duty, you may have an obligation, but you always have an obligation to protect your own sanctity. And so if by saying nothing you lose your peace, it causes angst, then you failed yourself first and foremost. Right. She's not telling her you're living in sin. She's using the I was raised Catholic. Well, do you know where the nearest Mass is? This is a very innocuous statement. You're speaking to her Catholicity, because she's identifying as having been raised Catholic. That means there's something in my heart, there's something interior that knows what's right.
She said she was raised. Why not?
Well, she's not.
Well, that's my point.
And that's... Okay, the second statement you can't assume. Because when you do that, then you immediately shut off your ability to be present to her as an instrument of conversion. Because when you project intent, she probably has no intent. So we get cases all the time of people who have been in long-term homosexual relationships, and they're going to do something. Something's going to happen in their life, and there's a prick of conscience.
I know lots of Catholic practice are going.
So let's clean up language. They don't get to determine whether they're Catholic or not. Let that sink in. They don't get to determine that. When they wear the indelible mark of Christ, that doesn't come off. They can't renounce it. They can't get rid of it. When they wear the indelible mark of baptism, they can't get rid of it. They may deny their heritage, but they're saying they're not Catholic does not erase that mark. So I always tell people, I just lead because confession is the way back in for every Catholic. They know the way back in. And so confessions are Saturday, 3 o'clock, St. Joseph. And just let it lay. Because that's always the way they're going to have to come back in. But when we talk about the door being open, it doesn't mean that we go out and tell these people, look, you don't have to go to confession, you don't have to come back to the sacraments. That's not it at all, because in doing that, that's a disservice. Say again? Then you're condoning it. Correct. Well, you're accepting. Yeah, it's an acceptance, and you can't, in good conscience, do that. So back to those spiritual works of mercy. Yes. Yeah, so I don't have pronouns. I have adjectives. Handsome, brilliant. And so the thing is we know it's absurd. We know it's absurd. So you have to go at this with the purity of a child. My grandson is, at the time this happens, my grandson's 4 years old. And ranch kids, farm kids about this age, this is when they start looking under the farm animals to see if it's a male or a female. And so they realize there's difference in body parts. And so he's at that age, he's looking under at everything, you know. And so it's either a him or a her. So he's with Valerie at the grocery store, and there's one of these people. And they have the name tag, and that doesn't help. It's like Pat. You know, it just... The name's not giving a clue. The haircut's not giving a clue. The body type's not giving a clue. And so this kid is perplexed because it is his job in his mind to sort every single thing in the world as either a him or a her. And so he's looking at her, and Valerie's thinking, oh, God, just don't say anything. Just don't say anything. And so as she's facilitating the purchase, he gets away from her, and he walks over to this person who's bagging. He walks all the way around her. And he looks up at her, and then he comes back and he pulls on Valerie's dress and he goes, "Is that a him or a her?" Everybody cracked up. And to her credit, this woman laughed too. And she says to him, "I was born a her." And that's it. And so as they're leaving, Brody says, "She's still a her." It goes on. And so those of you who have ever been around livestock, when a female cow or sheep or any of that goes barren, they start to change, their body type starts to change. And so when a bunch of cows come in at the end of the season, they've either got a calf or they don't have a calf. And so when they've got a calf coming to the weaning pens, you can see their ribs. It's not that they're emaciated, but they've been milking and they've got a 500-600 pound calf alongside. They don't have the cover that a cow that doesn't have a calf. And so those cows would always be sorted off, and we would double check pregnancy. More often than not, they would be open, meaning they're not pregnant. And so by the time Brody is 6, when he sees women with girth, she's open. So we told him, you really can't do that. Because every once in a while, somebody's going to know what you mean. And so it's the things that come out, because we're sorting dries and wets, and this comes out in conversation. So as it was above, so it is below. So the admonishing the sinner, everything has to work within the economy of salvation, but in order for it to move out concentrically, you have to be in a position of peace, a position of sustainability. You have to have that 6-year-old innocence that says, when someone tells you, "I was raised Catholic," great, you know where the nearest church is. And really do it out of love and charity, not with a barb, not with an edge. But you're new to the neighborhood. Let me tell you where the nearest church is, so that what they see in your eyes, that's where they're going to read you. And so if you truly have that love and that charity, and toward our family members especially, because they're really going to be suspicious of you wanting to be in a superior position or in a dictatorial position, and that's not it at all. So if your motivation is pure, people read that, people pick up on that. And that's why when Brody says these things, and he is a child, there's an innocence with him. There's not a barb. There's not an insult involved. Oh, this is great. This is the greatest gift in the world. Oh, it absolutely is. You don't have to talk. You don't have to. Oh, thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. Literally, this is the opportunity to be St. Francis. You preach every day, never use words. And really and truly, if you're no different than they are, if you get exasperated, frustrated, curse, and stomp, what's the value of Jesus? It didn't make you different. That's what they're saying. That's what they're poking. And you can rest assured that when you start turning toward seeking sanctity, they're going to try everything they can to show you how holy you're not. And you have to say, thanks be to God. Because if I'm truly desiring holiness, then I can sit without frustration, without anger, at my mother's funeral preparation and let my siblings do that. Say again? I can tell. You're still irritated. And seriously, no. Show them.
Are they going to Catholic or church?
So you have to be.
Okay.
So you have to be radically different. That's the whole thing. You have to be radically different. The peace has to just radiate from you. You have to be radically different. And then they have to say, I want the peace that she has. You have to be the Blessed Mother. So that prayer, that light of Christ prayer, Lord, let them see themselves as you see them, and let me see them as you see them. That's where the value is. That's where the peace is. And so it's this understanding that at some point, if they are Catholic, if they're raised Catholic, especially if they've had the 3 sacraments of initiation, they've eaten his flesh and they've drank his blood. At some point, the desire for the Eucharist is going to become very strong within them. And so that's what that prayer is. Lord, let them see themselves as you see them. They've yet to face a crisis or an event in their life that drives them to their knees. But thanks be to God, they've got a Catholic foundation that when that happens, and it does drive them to their knees, they know the way back in. Yes?
I had an brilliant, probably here's something when I came back. I have never found anybody that there has to be something about what you're, but on that, I left and came back.
Yep. All of it has to be done with the charity and the desire for salvation. Yep. Yes. And it may not be in our lifetime. So if we're praying for a change of behavior, that prayer is going to be hard. And we're not going to see it work the way it ought to work, the way we think it ought to work. So don't pray to change behavior. Pray that light of Christ prayer, that there's a prick of conscience, that there's something, or that they mention to somebody. You know, that they make a comment to a Jerry on the golf course, or they make a comment to Tom at the Knights, or they make a comment to somebody. But what you got to realize is, when somebody makes that comment to you, when somebody says, I was raised Catholic, this is not on you. The Holy Spirit's already put you together. You're entering the 3rd, 4th, 5th act of a play that's already ongoing. God's just giving you the opportunity to be His voice in this moment. That's what's happening. And it's not on you whether they go, snap, you're right, I'm wrong, I'll change. You may be the 1,000th voice out of 5,000 that are necessary. All of us know that there are souls which are extremely high maintenance. They got to hear things constantly. It's the tolling of the truth. It's the drip, drip, drip. These souls are extremely high maintenance. Some of our friends, some of the people who are seeking holiness are extremely high maintenance. But that's to our benefit too, because we have to toll the truth. You got to make sure that no matter how many times they ask you, how many different ways they phrase it, you got the same answer. Yeah, so that, and again, shameless plug, www.montecristo.net. There are videos there. One of them's on the story of the prodigal. The prodigal father prays for the prick of conscience, the coming to senses of his son. He doesn't pray that he returned from the pig pen. And so the prick of conscience that the boy has, it says, and he came to his senses, and his first statement, which is going to tell you what he came to, was, I have sinned against heaven and against you, Father. You remember him practicing his confession in the pig pen before he decides to leave? And so what you're wanting to facilitate is that prick of conscience. You're wanting to facilitate that moment where they have a choice. Now, they may not choose the way you choose. They may not choose the way you want them to choose. Yes. So in that prayer, when you're saying, Lord, let them see themselves as you see them, ultimately all prayer goes to God the Father. But 90% of the people who are away from the faith is because they have a problem with suffering. And so that's going to be a prayer to Christ. And so some of that visual is, how does Christ see them from the cross? Suffering. Yeah, they have a problem with a resistance to discharging the obligations of vocation, to discharging their station in life, accepting their identity, whatever that may be, but it's a mission-oriented issue. So do you have your Flow of Grace handout? Flow of Grace handout. Go back to that Flow of Grace handout. He's failing at that first station, which is to receive love unconditionally. God chose that mother. So his anger's at God the Father. But the problem is with regard to governance. So he leaves the church to get even with God the Father. Yes, sir. Okay. It does. And so it brings a certain emotional consolation, but it may fall short. And so, again, we can't will the action of another, and God's not going to override the free will. What he's going to do is prick the conscience. It's one of the most effective prayers that we've ever promulgated or that we've ever seen used. Because where we started to use it was, people would say, my son, my daughter they're diabolically afflicted. And so our question is, do they know it and do they want help? And they say, no, they don't know it. Well, you got to bring a realization, because you can't help someone who doesn't realize they need the help. And they, ultimately have to ask. And so typically what happens is as you start praying that prayer, then there's a psychological warfare portion to that prayer that's very, very important, especially for people who are away from the church. is you have to project into the cosmos, project in your prayer. Prayer's projection. And so we project this image of this person when they were in right relationship with God, when they were right with regard to the sacrament. And so if you have to go all the way back to baptism, for mothers who have children away, multi-sensory prayer, you held that child, you smell that chrism oil in that child's hair. You got a vivid memory of that day when he was baptized or when First Communion. You may have a picture of when they were in their white suit or white dress at First Communion. You got a picture when they were in confirmation. Those pictures need to come up in the house. They need to be put up. That needs to be how you see that person all the time when you're praying. And what's going to happen is when you talk to this person, if it's face to face, they're going to see that reflection in your eyes. They're going to hear that in your voice. And it's amazing how effective it is. I'll give you a classic example. We had a case where a young man was away from the faith and he had been in a homosexual lifestyle, deviant lifestyle. He had moved to the UK. His mother had been praying for him all along. And she came to us and said, this is what's happening and he needs help. We said, does he know he needs help? No, he's obstinate. And so he was extremely angry with his father. And his mother and father were married. They were still together. The father's health was failing, and he was having dementia, and he was incapable of conversation. And the boy wanted him to answer for certain things that he had done to him, and there was just a raging anger on this boy's part. And so when his mother first started praying this prayer, what he started doing was telling her, I'm considering just taking my life. That'll show Dad, etc., etc. Then he began to send her pictures of methodologies. He'd send her a rope tied in a hangman's noose. He'd send her a picture of a gun. He'd send her a picture of these things, car running in a garage. And so she was beside herself. And so we said, here's what you do. Is every time he sends you these pictures on your phone, you send back a picture of him at First Communion, a picture of him at confirmation, a picture of him. She had a wonderful picture of he and his brother as altar servers. The brother had died in an accident. So ultimately, we get down to the anger at God was that his brother had died. And he really went off the rails at that point. But anyway, so she begins to pray that. He begins to show her these pictures. And so she says, it's not working, it's getting worse. We say, just stay the course. Don't say anything to him. Don't take his calls. Just send him these pictures. Every time he tries to call or text, you just send those pictures. It took 3 months for it to break. When it broke, he sent back to her the picture of he and his brother as altar servers. And so for about a month, they didn't talk. There was just this exchange of pictures. Then he began to talk. And so it was less than a year from the very first picture she sent. He goes through formal exorcism. He's delivered. And the homosexuality, all of the suicidal ideation, every bit of that was gone. He forgave his father. And that's the most dramatic example of that prayer and how it works that I can give you. But we've had countless examples of how that works. Yes, ma'am. Okay, so you can. Our email address, my email address is info@dolorans, DOLORANS.org. And so what we're going to tell you when you contact us is, number one is, does the person that you're requesting help for, do they think they need help? And until they do, we'll put you on that prayer prescription to kind of bring an awareness. Contact your priest, get permission to pray the Auxilium Christinorum prayers 3 times a day and do some other disciplines in prayer. And then when this person starts to come around, then you suggest to them, or just ask them, do you think you have a problem? Do you think something's keeping you from returning to the faith? And then you can go from there. But there's a procedure. Yes, ma'am. So if you're going to pray the Auxilium Christinorum prayers, if you read through all of the prescriptions for that on the app, on everything, the introductory part, yeah, you need the permission of your priest to pray it. Here's why, is those prayers are spiritual warfare prayers. They're very direct, they're very succinct, and he knows your spiritual state better than we do. And so we can't give someone permission to do that. There are souls who are in a fragile state. he'll be aware of through confession or through relationship. And people who are not in a state of grace probably, or aren't trying to get in a state of grace, probably shouldn't pray the prayers.
So you pray the prayer for?
No. Her question was, if you're going to pray the prayers, should you ask your priest? And so we recommend that you need...
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You're praying for them.
No, you're praying them for you. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so what you're praying, what the Auxilium Christianorum prayers do is provide you protection, because when you start praying for an individual who is diabolically afflicted, you open yourself to retaliation. The Auxilium prayers protect you. They afford you protection as you engage in this process. No, if that's the way it sounded, I misspoke. Anyone can pray the Light of Christ prayer, because it's not, and it doesn't have any direct, it's not a direct confrontational prayer. It's a request for grace to prick conscience. And so this is not something that the demon's going to retaliate against you for. If you go beyond that, then you need some protection. Yeah, you need some protection beyond that. Many people are praying the Auxilium prayers. It brings you to a much deeper spirituality. The theology of the prayers is really, really good. It brings you to a deeper appreciation of the Blessed Mother, who she is, how this whole thing works. Part of the prayer is the Litany of the Precious Blood. Praying that Litany of the Precious Blood is a very good devotion, daily devotion. It helps you orient yourself towards salvation. And so the prayers, each one of them, they have different daily prayers. And for those of you who are praying them, they're of a great benefit to your inner peace and your path to sanctity. So, but it depends on what form the attack takes. I mean, and so first of all is if we replace the word attack with opportunity. So what's happening? What am I perceiving? Is it a secondary thing? Do I perceive that something's oppressing my finances or my relationships or these things? Then consecration of your external goods to the Blessed Mother and reading through the theology in that prayer. If you read through the theology of that prayer, it really changes your disposition to your temporal goods and even to your health. And so you realize, ooh, man, as I'm reading through this prayer, I may be a little bit too attached to this particular thing. And so there's the real benefit. Remember that the demon is, whatever's happening, if he's being allowed to afflict you, ultimately it's for your good. It's for your ongoing conversion. It's for your return to the path of salvation. Well, it's always good to seek counsel from your priest, but yeah, it's always good to seek counsel from your priest. So the thing is remember the old prescription in the Old Testament that if you had a spot come up on your skin, you'd go to the priest, and he would determine if that was leprous, if it was clean or unclean. Do you remember that? And so spiritually it is to go to Father and say, Father, I'm having these thoughts. I'm having these issues. And it's he determines, is that clean or unclean? Is that an indication of extraordinary diabolical activity or diabolical activity? Is this something that can be addressed through the hygiene of proper faith practice? That's the pastoral response. And so you should always exhaust the pastoral response before you resort to the extraordinary response. Well, sure, you can pray the wrong prayer. I mean, you can have the wrong intentions, and that's pretty common. The thing is you got to purify your desires and your intentions in light of salvation. So when we're praying, make this stop, that's taking the painkiller without getting to the root, because the pain is showing you something. Pain's got a purpose. Suffering, these discomforts, these things have a purpose. And so the demon being present to you, that shows you the low spot in your defenses. It shows you the low spot in your wall, thanks be to God. If I get offended at my siblings when I'm trying to plan my grandmother's funeral, this is showing me a low spot in my wall. It's showing me a place I'm not holy. And so the first response is immediately, thanks be to God for showing me this. And whatever it may be, I didn't mean to pick on you, but all of us have got these instances in our life. So whenever someone aggravates you, frustrates you, if your first response is, thanks be to God for showing me how holy I'm not, for showing me an area that I have to change, to get peace, to get a higher wall, to get that defense, then that's a good thing. Yes, ma'am. Okay, so yeah, there are a couple of observations. First of all is, they're called Father for a reason. And they're a father whether they think they are or not, or whether we think they're acting as one or not, they're still the Father. So, two admonitions. Men, father means father. And if you're saying father and his first name, that's probably a little bit more familiarity than you need. Make yourself say father and his last name. This elevates. And I would counsel priests that I was born in an age, but it's amazing what happens when we begin to call each other Mr. and Mrs. And when priests refer to somebody in a 40-year marriage or a 30-year marriage or a 10-year marriage as Mr. and Mrs. Formality brings dignity. It doesn't bring distance. It brings dignity. And so it's this understanding of where we are in relationship to each other is extremely important. We are way too familiar with each other. Familiarity breeds contempt. Second remark is that, men, he's not your brother, he's your father. And so don't submit a thing to him if you're not willing to take his direction on it. Do you understand what I'm saying? We all knew how to interact with our fathers. If I went and asked my father a question, I was bound to his answer. So be willing to be bound. If you're going to take something to him, be willing to be bound to his answer. So this is the difference between fathers and brothers. Women, go to the father as a daughter, not as a wife. It took me a long time to understand that Valerie would speak to me on 3 different levels. She will speak to me as all women speak to husbands on a level that doesn't need to be fixed, it just needs to be heard. It took me a long time to understand that. You don't have that relationship with your father. You didn't speak to your earthly father that way. Don't speak to this father that way. Don't tell him the sins of others. Tell him your sins. Tell him your issues. What are the things that are specific to you and your soul? This is going to change women's conversation with a priest dramatically. The best prayers that we can pray is let me see him as a father and let him see me as a daughter. For women. For men, let me see him as a father and let him see me as a son. Do you see what I mean? How hard is that to hear in our modern ear? It's extremely hard. Because since Vatican II especially, we've been brought to believe that priests are no different than us. They're just men. This is a priest of the Most High God. He is different, whether he thinks he is or not. So it is up to us to elevate, as laity, to elevate the discourse. Now, he's not a priest by merit. He's not in a position of authority by merit. But the Holy Spirit is going to speak to you through him. That's the way it is by providence. As it is above, so it is below. And when the priests understand the magnitude of this relationship, then they start to assume the mantle of fatherhood. Most of us are of an age, and we remember very well that people dressed their station in life. A lot of men wore uniforms. You knew exactly who they were. Businessmen went to work in a suit and a tie. I don't wear this suit and tie every day of these things so that you think any more of me. I want you to know how much I think of you. I remember a grandmother who never learned to drive and would go all week long, never leaving the ranch. And she was dressed every single day by breakfast. So that if somebody came by, and it was a remote ranch, but you would never catch her in her house coat after 7 o'clock in the morning. You never would. She dressed because she was the woman of that house, and that was her role. When we do those things, it's much easier for us to keep perspective of who we are in the flow of grace and who we are in the economy of salvation. So where would that authority come from? No. You approach a counselor, how would that authority be made manifest? How would the authority be made manifest? That's the correct answer. There is no authority. And so you're not going to them for authority, you're going to them for counsel, and then you're responsible to be sure that that is a pure source of counsel. And that's going to be almost impossible to do in the secular world. No. And I mean, you're asking a question that I can't possibly answer. I'll try this again. I'm going to try one more time. You're asking me a question I can't possibly answer. So if you're looking for good counsel, then what I would do is I would go to Father and I would say, where can you recommend? Now, for situations like this, there's a resource that we're not using. The resource is the holy widows in this parish. You want to know who to ask counsel? Show up here during the day and see who's praying. Show up here during the day and see the Annas in this parish. Show up here and ask Father, who can you recommend? We don't need to be paying outside counselors. What we need is the wisdom that is right here. But we have to be quiet and we have to listen. You have to get still in your soul and listen. And your inability to agree, you don't have to agree with the answers. You don't have to agree with the counsel. You have to subject yourself to it. And that's the hard part. Many people want spiritual direction, but they don't have spirits capable of receiving direction. There's a tremendous amount of wisdom in this room. Wisdom is knowledge with a bruise. There's a tremendous amount of wisdom in this room. Father will know people's circumstances. And to hook Christian to Christian in community, this is an extremely valuable thing. And a priest who's only in a parish 4 or 5 years can't do that. So the modern idea of priests being here only for a short period of time and then being moved, this is counter to tradition. But the secular priesthood is counter to tradition. The diocesan priesthood is counter to tradition. We're all wanting to go at faith as if it's something to be administered rather than to be lived and breathed. How are we for time? All right, 5 minutes left. Thanks be to God. Yes, sir. No. So the non-baptized, they're going to ultimately have to be baptized if they're going to receive liberation. The people who are not Catholic, if they're possessed and they're going to receive liberation, they have to come under the authority of the church in a formal way. Very simply, they're approaching the Catholic Church. They're asking the Catholic Church for liberation. So in order for the authority of the church to be manifest, to drive the demon out in a classic possession, they have to submit to the authority of the church. That's one of the psychological compatibilities or anchor points between the demon and the human, is they don't recognize the governance of the Catholic Church. And so all exorcism is done through that authority, through that juridical dissemination of authority. We've got priests who are possessed. No one's beyond.
Catholics that ask.
There's some. It's not a large number, but there are some. The thing about it is remember that the only possessions that we have contact with are contested possessions. Let that sink in. There's a tremendous number of people who are possessed by the demon that are not contesting the possession. There's a lot of people who are possessed by the demon. They have a relationship where they've allowed the demon interior, and he's present to them. He is in fact possessing or often driving, and they're not contesting that relationship. They've made a deal, and they're living the deal. Okay, let me make a blanket statement. No one is possessed through no fault of their own. So every once in a while, the demon will be present in a highly obsessive way to holy souls. But it's not a classic possession. Classic possession, and this is where you need to get into the literature, a lot of things are called possession that aren't classic possession. They don't meet all the criteria. You've got a few instances, and the exception accentuates the rule, where the demon animates the body of a holy person or attacks them. So for instance, Gemma Gilgani is afflicted by the demon in a different way than Padre Pio is afflicted by the demon. And so when you read these accounts, then you see the diagnostic criteria. Often it's called a possession, but it's actually a deep obsession. It's not a classic possession. Classic possession, the demon can't leave. So if you've got if you're hearing anything about periods of lucidity, periods of functionality, that's not consistent with a classic possession. And so the fact that the demon can come and go and can get some distance is an indication that you're not quite at a perfected or a classic possession.
You personally?
Up until last year, I was sitting in about 400 hours a year of classically possessed people solemn session. No, Annalise Michel was a very heavy obsession, and it had features of possession. And so that's debatable. She has things. The thing about Annalise Michel is there was things that were consistent with victim soul, but there were things that were inconsistent with victim soul. And so one of the classic things with regard to victim soul is that historically and traditionally has always been at a request of God. It hasn't been at an offer of the human. So here's what I'm trying to say: is it's always been at God's request, not the Blessed Mother. And so that's one of the questionable features. But again, that is such an anomaly. That is such a departure from the norm and the bulk of the cases that when people study it, they get a false understanding of what the majority of cases look like, because they want to compare it to that one. Just be a holy man. Be a holy man. And it helps if he has a very peaceful, prayerful wife who is not disturbed by any of this. Seriously, if you're going to send a warrior into battle, it doesn't need to be hearing the histrionics of a woman behind him. You need to be solid in your faith, because you're sending a warrior to the front lines. You got to support him. Say it again. Yeah, the natural trajectory is that we start with in the majority of the cases, you start with an oppression, and it progresses into an obsession, and then it'll progress into a possession. That's the normal course of normal trajectory. If it's not addressed, you have all these opportunities to address it at the lower levels. So oppression is the demon is on the outside. He's working on the outside, trying to get in. And then obsession, there's 3 levels. And so the demon starts to become interior. By mid-level obsession, you got a running diabolical commentary. He's in the person's head. He's constantly present to them, so it's going to be difficult for them to get any clarity. There's other features of it. It's a very detailed process of training to understand the diagnostics, but I'm just giving you some of the features. By the time he's in 3rd level obsession, he's not hearing anything except the diabolical. He literally cannot hear holy speech. Yes, sir? Oh. So think about it this way. Think about it this way. Our Lord is a suitor. The demon is a seductor. Our Lord will only go where He's invited. The demon will go everywhere He's not resisted. So he begins to build a relationship, and it's actually a courtship. It's a mockery of courtship. And so until the human begins to resist, he will take them into deeper and deeper sin, further and further separation from God, more and more isolation, until there's something that pricks the human's conscience. And then they say, okay, I want to stop this relationship. And that's when the battle starts. That's when the spiritual warfare really starts. It's when they want to return to God. Yes. So it's not a possession. The fact that you're sitting here is a pretty good indicator, and have been able to sit here all week long is probably a pretty good idea. Not in my presence, but in our Lord's presence. And so you've spent a significant amount of time without there being a physical adverse reaction. So the questions that we would ask is, do you have trouble on retention of non-religious text? Okay, then it's not going to be diabolical. This is going to be a key thing, is the diabolical will only afflict you and impair you in and within a religious context. So if you'd told me, no, I can read an article in a magazine and remember it word for word, but I can't remember the daily mass readings, now I've got an indicator that indicates diabolical affliction. Do you see what I mean? And so if you're telling me that there's a difficulty with regard to retention or recollection across the board on written text, then this is going to be more in line with a natural phenomenon. So the question is, for what purpose? So here's the thing, is Father Ripperger we have never promoted the SMD or promoted ourselves, and Father's never promoted himself. So when you have priests who have all of these websites, blog sites, media things that are promoting the phenomenology, they are dubious, because these guys tend to not last long. We've got 5 to 6 exorcists in the United States that go away every year. They fall to the demon because, this is a battleground. But those who are willing to act outside their jurisdiction and to draw attention to the phenomenology for the emotional effect, for the appeal, everything that you'll hear from Father Ripperger and everything hopefully you hear from me is what we've learned in doing this, so that you may protect yourself, so that you may, and we never give phenomenology to the demon. Well, you have a built-in BS meter, listen to it. Father Carlos Martins. Dubious. Okay, so here's the first thing that we do is we differentiate between ordinary and extraordinary diabolical activity. And so modernly what's happening is there's a lot of ordinary diabolical activity which is being responded to as if it were extraordinary because we're a bunch of snowflakes. We don't have any stomach for resistance. We don't have any stomach for growing holy. We all want to be holy, but we don't want to do the work. So oppression, light oppression, temptation, all of these things are normal, are ordinary diabolical activity. Extraordinary diabolical activity Then we're starting to see there's a direct religious context. It's directly targeted the person in a certain way. And then we start talking about affliction as in, okay, where is it working? Exactly what's going on. Is there physical discomfort? Is there psychological discomfort? Is there disorientation? A good example is what she just said. She doesn't have recall on written text. And so is there religious context? If she'd said, yeah, only sacred scripture, I can read everything else, but I can't read sacred scripture. Now the affliction is the inability to recall sacred scripture. You've got a religious context, and it's extraordinary. Do you see what I mean? Because it's beyond temptation or oppression or those things. So you methodically apply this criteria. And this is one of the things about the model that Father Ripperger and I developed, the protocol, all the Liber Christo methodology is it's objective, it's not subjective. There's a lot of these guys, in fact, the one that you mentioned as an exorcist is relying on a, quote, seer or a sensitive to say, yeah, that guy's possessed. That's highly unreliable, and it's very much focused on the phenomenology and not on objective criteria. Time. Thank you, guys.